I turned on the radio in my DeLorean and the Back to the Future theme music played loudly on the radio, and I modeled this car to look exactly like the one in the movie Back to the Future, but everything on this car is literally invincible, and as the original Back to the Future theme music played inside the car and Tony Stark heard it, me and him both of us smiled and felt nothing but nostalgia, and then Tony Stark said, "Oh god dude, that is so cool, and I feel like I'm in a movie and something very magical is about to happen." And right before I came to see Tony Stark, I had enough time make one more invention, and then I walked up to Tony Stark and I said, "Here, I wanted to personally give you this, Tony Stark, it's a..." And then Tony Stark interrupted me mid-sentence and said, "It's a lightsaber, isn't it?" And then I said, "Yes, it's a real lightsaber, Tony." And then Tony Stark hugged me and he said, "Give it to me please." And then Tony Stark took a deep breath as he held his lightsaber in his hand and he said, "Oh my god, please work like the real lightsaber." And I said, "You can change the color of the lightsaber by pressing the other button on the back of the lightsaber, or as you would call it, the hilt." And then Tony Stark said, "Now for the moment of truth." And then he stood in a sword stance and then Tony Stark pressed the button and a green laser like flash lit up everything and the lightsaber stabilized and took on the form of a sword. It was so fast and smooth it even made the same sound like in the movie Star Wars. And then Tony Stark stood there holding his lightsaber in disbelief and he said, "I can't believe what I'm holding in my hands right now. This has been the fantasy and dream of many scientists and nerds over the years, and I am holding a miracle of science in my hands." And then Tony touched the lightsaber and it burned him, but it also felt like a solid object, and then he said, "Incredible." And then Tony Stark said, "The only thing's missing now is a friendly sparring partner and the Force." And then I used my telekinetic powers to bring my lightsaber to my hands and I got into my sword stance, but I used my martial arts skills to display my spectacular sword skills, and my lightsaber is red. And then I said, "Come Jedi, show me what you're made of." And then Tony Stark said, "Oh man, we are definitely doing this." And then me and Tony Stark had a friendly lightsaber sparring match to test the powers of our lightsabers, and of course Tony Stark couldn't keep up with my skills wielding a lightsaber because my powers and skills are far greater than Tony Stark's, but with his new genius brain and mind he began to adapt very quickly. And then I said, "Yes, you're learning, Tony Stark, you're getting smarter." And then eventually Tony Stark started to mirror my sword fighting techniques with his lightsaber, and then I used Sith Force lightning. I simply gave myself all the abilities of Starkiller. You all know the Jedi from the video game Star Wars The Force Unleashed, so now I have all those abilities. And Tony Stark said, "Damn, no fair." And then I said, "Let's go for a drive and we can continue this later." And Tony Stark began healing his entire body with his sentry powers, and then me and Tony Stark went on an adventure across time on the MCU Earth. And then after all that happened, it was now time for all the events of the Avengers to happen, and like everything else that came and went, I pretty much stopped every threat with my incredible powers. No villain was a match for me and the more powerful versions of the original Avengers, and I was also surprised to find out that there's no mutants on my MCU Earth, so now things went a lot faster for me, and soon I was standing in front of Thanos. And then I decided to show him my Starkiller Force abilities, and I even showed him my lightsaber. And then Thanos said, "You have got to be kidding me, you're a Jedi." And then I said, "Yes I am." And then I easily killed Thanos with my Force abilities, and I cut off his arm and head with my blue lightsaber. And after that I went across every multiverse that needed help and I saved them all with my incredible powers, and I even saved every major anime universe including the Dragon Ball Universe 7 across every multiverse and across every timeline. I saved billions of people and I activated my special armor, and I said, "I am the Guyver," and the Dracula symbol appeared on my Guyver suit, and I said, "Let's get rid of all the bad guys." And then I moved at ultra light speed across every universe saving people, and I saved everyone in every universe, and that's how my story ends. Just kidding. I went back to the MCU Earth after I saved every universe and multiverse, and I retired and I came back home to the MCU Earth and I made love to all my wives and we all lived peacefully and we had many children after I destroyed every threat in the cosmos, and that's how my story ended.